are officially convened. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Interfaith Community Sanctuary, all of you who are kindly showing up today, and for those of you who are online. Today is October 1st, the first Sunday of the month, and as such, it's our guest speaker Sunday. And I'll be introducing Greg in just a minute. But first, as is our wont and our regular procedure here, we do start off our service with a recognition of our First Peoples and a calling in of the ancestors. And Steve has volunteered to do that this morning. Steve?
Greetings, everyone. On behalf of our community, I invite you to call in all those ancestors who precede us in living in this wonderful land and on our great grandmother Earth. All of those spiritual ancestors and all of our biological ancestors as well. And if we can just take a moment to take a deep breath and invite them in with us. I would also like to honor those peoples of the First Nations, particularly the coastal Salish tribes, who lived on this land and stewarded it for us far before we came and inhabited this area. I'd like to thank them for their wonderful stewardship and care of this land. I'd also like to honor all those beings who preceded our coming here, from the glorious vine maple who is adding color to our days, to the aspen and the big leaf maple, the deer, the frogs, the rivers and the rains which nourish our land. May we all give them honor and learn from their stewardship so that we may also be as grateful stewards as they have been.
Thank you, Steve. And next, another beautiful tradition that we have here each Sunday morning is presenting an offering for the Divine Feminine. And this morning, Chris?
Good morning, and I'd like to welcome you all. It's great to see a lovely group of people here. Thank you all for coming, and thank you all for joining us online. And I'm glad to hear Greg speak again from his tradition. And as such, I'd like to honor the Divine Feminine with a chant from the Eastern tradition, which we've done here many times, just JJ Ma. And I'd like to try and do that 9 times, 9 being a sacred number of the goddess. And please join me at home if you'd like. JJ Ma, 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 JJ Ma. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. So now, as I mentioned earlier, the first Sunday of every month is our visitor service, and it's been a tradition here for far longer than I have been around here. And as far as I know, it's one of the founding traditions in a faith community sanctuary, and that is to have representatives from various religious, spiritual backgrounds that can share their knowledge, their wisdom, and their experience with us. And this morning, I'm delighted to have someone who's not only a friend of mine, but is a very knowledgeable individual when it comes to the Buddhist tradition, especially from the Tibetan lineage. And Greg is a teacher and a writer, and has been offering seminars and classes and meditation gatherings here in the Seattle area for quite a while, since about approximately 2006. And his latest contribution is he has been part of this book. He helped in the translation from the Tibetan to the English from his teacher. I don't know how you pronounce his name. I should know that. Kancha Rinpoche. And it's a delightful book that I just finished reading, in Secret Paths of the Sadhus. And it's writing about that particular tradition, of the Dzogchen particular tradition, but he'll speak more to that. So anyway, without further ado, you don't want to listen to me, so I'm going to introduce now our guest this morning, Greg Patenaude.
Good morning. Can you guys hear me okay? All right. Well, thank you all for welcoming back. It's great to be back here. I was here in the spring. It's a lovely space that you guys have all created, this interfaith community. I do want to just quick pay, some respect and some attention to your dear leader, Karen. I know she's been going through some difficult time. And so, it's great to see all of you coming together in her absence to continue to support this space. I am a director for a Tibetan Buddhist nonprofit, and I can say one of the things that always is like on your mind as someone who leads an organization like this is what happens when I'm gone, right? Like, everyone kind of knows what's going on. Like, there's certain activities that we do again and again that people can kind of fill in. But there's a lot of unseen things that go on, that she's taking care of day to day, week to week, year to year. And just to see you guys, continue to band together and support this intention and in this community is great to see. So that I can say, from my perspective, that takes off a big burden for her, so she can really devote herself to her own practice and her own healing at this time. So thank you, and I hope Karen, the best of wishes, and hope her health recovers quickly. So George invited me here today to speak about traveling the spiritual path from I'm Buddhist, so I've been practicing as a Buddhist since 2004, very kind of, there's many different types of Buddhism. Tibetan Buddhism has four main lineages. I practice within the Nyingma Kagyu lineage, so that's kind of the spiritual lineage that I come from. So I'm going to be speaking about traveling the spiritual path from that perspective today, but I recognize that, there's many different faiths here today, many different traditions. So I hope in some way, by me sharing my perspective, that you can find some resonance, something that kind of identifies with your own experience, your own practice, your own faith. So I want to start with a question, actually. As I was thinking about this today, the idea of a pilgrimage kind of came to mind. So I'm wondering, has anyone here done a pilgrimage? Any kind of pilgrimage at all? Where did you go? Nice, okay. Michael?
Been on lots of pilgrimages.
Okay. There was someone, Steve?
I went on a pilgrimage way back in college days to one of the missions in western Idaho from eastern Washington to western.
Okay. I thought there was someone else too. Mecca, nice. So each tradition has some version of a pilgrimage. There's usually some type of destination in mind. You're traveling to a holy site, a sacred site. There's usually some kind of call, right? There's something that's kind of calling us to go on this pilgrimage. And that can take many different forms. It can be healing, right? Someone can be sick. They can be going through some challenging, either physical or mental, emotional situations where they're looking for healing. It can just be a call to connect with something sacred, right? We don't have a lot of, especially in America, in the West, we don't have a lot of sacred things anymore, right? It's like the sacred has somehow eluded us in our day-to-day. And so the call to go on a pilgrimage can be the call to connect with something sacred again, something that's beyond the kind of ordinary day-to-day of our life. And sometimes it can also be a call to make an offering, right? There's something that's kind of calling you to go on this journey, to share something, to bring a gift to this sacred site. Welcome. So, this idea of a pilgrimage, one of the things that there's kind of three phases, I think, to going on a pilgrimage, and these kind of relate to our own spiritual practice as well, in a way that I hope can be made apparent. So first is this intention to go, right? We have this kind of calling that we recognize, this yearning that we want to fill, right? There's something missing in our life, and we want to fill this with this journey. And so there's the call, and then there's the actual path, right? Which is different. There's the intention to go, and like the preparation that goes into that, kind of the preparatory practices, the planning, things like that. But then there's the actual path, right? The actual walking on the path, traveling the path. And then once we get to that destination, and I think this is one of the kind of crucial parts as Westerners that we learn to identify in our practice, is once we go to the destination, we come back with something, right? And one of the biggest challenges we have, especially those who've been on a pilgrimage, is you've identified something in your life, some kind of wisdom, maybe some kind of blessing, some kind of gift. And now the challenge is, how do you bring that back into the real world, right? How do you bring that back into your family? How do you bring that back into your job? How do you bring that back into your community? And so that challenge of, I've gone on this journey, and now I want to bring something back. It's not even that you want to bring something back. It's that you have to. Now that you have this thing, this experience, this wisdom, this realization, this blessing, this gift, now that you have that, to not bring it back, to just kind of hold on to it or to kind of stash it away somewhere, isn't actually paying the full respect to that thing that's transformed your life. And so, as spiritual practitioners, we go through the exact same thing in our process. We're all called to spiritual practice in some way, some shape, some form. It takes many different forms, but there's something in us that's calling us to recognize what's sacred in our life. And it's not enough just to have that calling, to have that intention. We actually need to dedicate ourselves to practice, right? We need to travel the path. We need to engage in practice. We need to, from a Buddhist tradition, we need to meditate. We need to, engage in practices like compassion, generosity. So we need to travel the path. We need to engage in the path. But as we do that, we have these experiences on the path, and then we need to learn how to integrate that with our life. We need to learn how to, recognize those gifts, that wisdom that we've acquired on the path, and then learn how to bring that back into our communities. And so I see these two things, pilgrimage, this idea of like a spiritual journey, an outward spiritual journey, and then our spiritual practice, which is really like an inward spiritual journey, as very similar. And I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from the two. So George asked me to share a little bit of the Buddhist tradition, and so I'm going to share a little bit of that today. But that's just kind of some of the background that I wanted to kind of share of, how we, from a Buddhist perspective, how I kind of see the path, right? I don't see spirituality as something separate from the rest of my life. It's more that the rest of my life kind of revolves around my spirituality, my faith, my practice, right? Sometimes that conception of spirituality, I don't know, for a lot of people that, not probably for you guys because you're here every Sunday, but for a lot of people that can be like kind of wishy-washy, right? Oh, spiritual, like what does that mean to be spiritual or religious, right? But I think a lot of us can identify with the idea of a practice, right? And so spiritual practice is just something that we're committing to day to day, something that we're engaging in, something that we're dedicated to or committed to. Actually, as I was talking about how life revolves around a spiritual practice, when I went on pilgrimage in 2008 to India and Nepal, and from a Buddhist tradition, one of the things you do when you go to these sacred sites is you do what's called kora, which is like it's just circumambulating around these either stupas or temples or whatever it is. And so you're doing these circumambulations, you're just walking around the site. A lot of times along the path, there's places to make offerings. You light candles or make offerings to things along the way. But there's this idea that like your life is kind of revolving around this thing in the middle, right? As a spiritual practitioner, it's very easy for me to say that my life revolves around my practice. And that gives me a lot of confidence, gives me a lot of ability to take in a lot of things into my own practice. When I look at a lot of people in the West who are suffering, it's because they don't have anything that their life revolves around, or the things that their life revolves around aren't actually able to accommodate or encompass all those different aspects of your life, right? So if your life revolves around your work, well, that has a certain function, but like, can you integrate that with your family, with your community, with your faith? Maybe your work can do that, but a lot of times it becomes something that is like conflicting with our life, right? So our work conflicts with our family, with our relationship. Our work conflicts with our spiritual practice. And so, it's figuring out what do we want to place at the center of our life so that our work can revolve around that, our family can revolve around that, our time in our community can revolve around that. I think that's one of the true blessings that we have as practitioners on the path, that we're able to identify what's actually important in our life, right? What's really going to have significance or meaning, what's really going to have benefit. I'm sure all of you have seen this, like the theory of relativity. They have that, it's like a black, tarp or like canvas or whatever, and then they put like a really heavy object in the middle, and like then all of the other objects just start rotating around that. And that's how we should think about our practice, right? It's like this, it has this weight in our life, this kind of, like we feel it. It has some like mass, right? And everything else, because of that mass, everything else revolves around that effortlessly, really. It's not like we need to create that. It's just when that is the center, and when we know it's the center, then everything else just kind of starts to fall into place. So, all right, Buddhist practice. So the Buddhist practice, we generally, so in my tradition, we have something called preliminary practices. And these are kind of like the planning, the preparatory stages of the spiritual journey. And the key point with the preliminaries is that these are giving you like the foundational skills, the foundational kind of insight, the kind of fundamental tools that you're going to need on the spiritual path, right? And so one of the things that is kind of the standard preliminaries is these 4 contemplations. So these 4 contemplations are the precious human life, impermanence, karma, which is cause and effect, and then suffering. And so part of the kind of preparatory practices for engaging in our own spiritual practice is contemplating these things in our own daily life. First, precious human life. We have this great opportunity. We have a lot of freedoms, a lot of advantages, and we have the ability to actually use our life for a great purpose, right? Like we actually have this potential, this capacity to use our life for something meaningful, something that's going to make a difference or have a positive impact, right? And so that's the first thing, precious human life. The second contemplation is impermanence. This life is impermanent, right? Our bodies are constantly changing. Our supporting conditions, like right now, we might have the right conditions to actually engage in practice and to learn and study and find a community that we can support us. But we don't know when that's going to change, right? We have the conditions now, but we might not have them tomorrow. And so the contemplation of impermanence is not only the contemplation that things are changing, but of course, contemplating our own death, our own mortality, and just coming to terms with that. Like, what is the significance of that? Are we able to approach death, even the thought of death, with openness and with dignity, or are we really afraid of that doorway? So that's a really powerful practice, because when we can be open to our own impermanence, it's much easier to be open to the constantly changing reality of our day-to-day experience. And then the third, so precious human life, we have this great opportunity, but it's impermanent, right? We need to use it now. And so that leads to the contemplation on karma. And this is really the contemplation of cause and effect. That if we want something to happen, it doesn't happen uncaused, right? It's not like something's just going to kind of spontaneously happen. Like we need to plant the positive seeds. We need to kind of, engage intentionally with our life, the way we speak, the way we act, our thoughts. And then we need to also recognize the negative behaviors, the negative actions, the negative, like the problems that we're creating for ourselves, right? And recognize how those are binding us in some way, right? And so learning to recognize that I need to cut off certain things in my life that aren't supporting me in this practice. So that's the contemplation of karma. And karma in this, from the Buddhist tradition, we don't have many people in the West have I would say like a Hindu interpretation of karma, where it's like, you're reborn into as a dog or something, right? Like It's like you don't have control over your karma. The key thing with karma is that, yes, you have control, actually. All of your actions have an effect. And those you have control over, you have power over, the power to change. So it's not deterministic. It's not like a retribution sort of thing where you're kind of like subject to karma and karma's like somehow attacking you. No, you're the creator. You're the creator here. And then the fourth is suffering, the contemplation on suffering. And that one's pretty easy because I think we're all suffering in various ways. And this also connects to the Four Noble Truths. So the first noble truth is the truth of suffering, right? And from the Buddhist perspective, suffering is really actually the doorway into the spiritual path. And that can be kind of interesting to think about. Like, why is that? Why is suffering the doorway into the spiritual path? I don't know, actually. I mean, I have my own view, my own perspective. But I think that's an interesting question to sit with in your own practice. And one of the things, in my own perspective, and I'll share it with you, is that we're constantly trying to get away from suffering, right? We're constantly trying to somehow escape our kind of negative feelings. If we have some kind of illness, we're trying to escape that. We're trying to get away from the present moment, right? Whatever's happening right now is a little bit too intense, and so I need to try to get away from that, right? And that impulse, or that habit, I guess you could say, is what keeps us trapped on this wheel, right? It's this wheel of reactivity. And the thing is, there's actually, if we're engaging in a reactive pattern or a reactive way of living, we can never really truly experience freedom. We might experience freedom for just a little bit, but then something else is going to come up, right? Because that's just life. Something's always coming up. And so if we're always reacting to our experience, then, freedom is always like just outside of our grasp. It's like right there. Like we think, gosh, I have the perfect job. I make good money. I have a nice house. I have, a family. I have a good relationship. All this kind of stuff. And somehow still I'm like, it's not enough. Somehow I'm still suffering, right? And so freedom is always like that openness, that freedom, that ability to actually be present and actually like fulfilled, content, the sense of enough. It always just seems like just out of reach. It's like right there, but we can't grab it. And it's because of this habit of trying to escape suffering. And so with the truth of suffering, what we're actually learning to do is to be open to suffering. Just to acknowledge suffering. I can sit with suffering. I can sit with my pain. I can sit with my unhappiness. I can sit with anxiety, right? And I don't need to be overwhelmed by it. So it can be present. I can experience it, but it doesn't need to dominate my experience. It's part of my experience, but my experience can accommodate that, right? There's the idea of sacred is connecting with something that's like holy, right? And holy comes from the root whole, right? And I think that's, in our spiritual practice, what we're trying to do is become whole again. We're trying to include all the fragmented parts of our experience, all the gaps the things that are missing. And we're trying to identify this sense of being, this sense of presence, in which we can be fully open to whatever's coming up. And by using suffering skillfully, we can start to let go of that cycle of reactivity. We can let go of our aversion to suffering. And we can also let go of our attachment to whatever we think it is that's going to fulfill us, right? And so by cutting through attachment, by cutting through aversion, what we actually find is that we're able to open ourselves up to the present moment. We're able to sit with things as they are and be open to our experience. And so that's that's why they say suffering is the doorway to the spiritual path. Because once you can do that, then you can start to be open to more and more, right? You can continue to, from a Buddhist perspective, actually the path is really cutting through attachment, cutting through aversion, and then cutting through confusion. Confusion about who we are, confusion about the world around us, the nature of reality, and also confusion about our place in that mix. And so by opening ourselves up to suffering, we're opening up this inner landscape that we can travel in our own practice, through our meditation, through our engaging in our daily life with compassion, with kindness, with generosity. We can identify where we're holding on to things, right? I want to be compassionate. I have a 9-year-old child, and she's a wonderful kid, but she's 9. she's like, at times she's completely overwhelming. And I want to be kind to her, and I want to be compassionate, but like sometimes I just want to be like, cut it off, right? Go to your room. And so it's identifying when we're holding on to our experience in such a way that's not actually helpful, right? And so how do we let go of that? How do we open ourselves up? How do we discover that freedom to actually act with intention and with kindness, with generosity? So, yeah, I could go on and on for a long time, but George said 20, 30 minutes. So I want to open up, or what time, I don't know what time I'm supposed to talk to.
You have plenty of time.
All right.
Until like 11:30.
Okay, I can talk for another 10. Yes, let's do that.
Repeat those last 3 things you said about your goal as a Buddhist. It ended with cutting through confusion. What were the other?
Oh, yes. Well, the path. So that goes into the second noble truth. I think someone else had a question too. I'll get to that. No? Steve, yeah. I'm going to get to hers because it's the second noble truth. So I got her first.
Okay, so you talked about being alive as an opportunity, and being causal, and then experiencing suffering, and then relaxing into it, embracing it, to experience it. How does being causal as an agent of causality interact with suffering? Does it make sense to not do anything about suffering? Or is it a natural human response to, let's say you have a sore back, and you can feel your sore back, that's what it is. But then you find some exercises to do, and then it goes away. So is that outside of the Buddhist practice, or is that within it somehow?
No, that'd be just skillful action, right? Like if you have a sore back, you should, either go see a doctor or like you should address the situation, not just ignore it. Ignoring, so that's one thing is when we're dealing with suffering, being open to suffering, it doesn't mean, so one of the dangers is that like we become a kind of nihilistic in a way, right? Where we're kind of like, well, then I don't need to do anything, right? But that's actually not recognizing the power of cause and effect, right? And so we need to navigate, one, being open to suffering or challenging situations, but also two, always recognizing our power to change and to plant the seeds that are gonna benefit that situation. So I mean, a lot of times people in work situations, they'll under the guise of a compassionate bodhisattva, this awakened practitioner who's like on the spiritual path to benefit other beings. Under the guise of this compassion, they'll let their boss or their coworkers get away with things that are ridiculous, right? But they're not actually confronting. Being open also means being responsive, right? It doesn't mean being passive. It doesn't mean. I always like when I come to this idea, I always like the idea of a dance, because the type of compassion that we're talking about here is a open, responsive, flexible, available compassion. It's not okay, you can just do it, just wheel me around the dance floor and I'll just do whatever you want me to do. That's not the type of compassion we're talking about here. Meeting the situation as it is, which sometimes means meeting it with intensity, meeting it with presence, right? Like, people use power and control in many different ways to manipulate people and to control people for their own advantage. But that also can perpetuate a lot of suffering, not only for ourselves, but for other people in our environment. And so sometimes compassion means having that presence, calling that presence to take a stand, right? So yeah, don't confuse like being open to suffering as like, well, I'm just going to let whatever happens happen then, and hopefully it works out, because that's not going to work out too well for you. All right, so now we'll continue with the other noble truths. So the first noble truth was the truth of suffering, which we talked about. The second noble truth is the truth of the origin. So basically what gives rise to suffering. And those three are attachment, aversion, and confusion. And so basically the instruction for that second noble truth is to let go of attachment, aversion, and confusion. And so this is like, when we think about our practice, we can start to, that's like instruction, right? So when we're sitting in our meditation, we can recognize what we're holding on to, and then we can let go of that. We can recognize what we're averse to, what we're kind of like not willing to be open with, and we can let go of that, open ourselves up. In the book that we recently published this spring, Secret Path of the Siddhas by my teacher, I helped edit that and get that into kind of publication mode. But we talk about, one of the practices we talk about there is this practice of letting go. How do we open up and relax into the natural state? How do we rest in the natural state? And so it's just working with that within our meditation allows us to carry that skill set, those tools, out into our daily life, right? So meditation is kind of like you could say it's like a laboratory, right? It's like your workshop. But then from the workshop, you carry those skills, those tools, that knowledge, that wisdom out into your daily interactions. And then confusion is Buddhist philosophy. I'm sure many of you have stumbled upon Buddhist philosophy in some shape or form. It's very extensive, it's very vast. The Buddhist tradition has a very rich intellectual, kind of academic, philosophical tradition. And so, getting rid of confusion has many layers. But fundamentally, it's about confusion about the nature of the self, the nature of reality, and just identifying, where those are creating more suffering, right? And so for the self, it's identifying, I think of myself as like this body. Am I Greg? Am I this consciousness, right? Like where is the self, right? Who is the self? What's continuing from moment to moment? And so it's contemplating the nature of the self. And then reality, right? Is reality, is it just atoms? Is it matter? From a scientific perspective, it's changed a lot recently, but it used to be that the world that we experienced was just matter, right? It's just elements and atoms and particles, and that was kind of it, right? And somehow consciousness was like this other thing. And so, how do those interact, right? From a Buddhist perspective, what we say is everything is interdependent. So we think of the self as separate. We think of the world as like an object, right? Something that we experience. But they're not separate, right? They're interconnected, they're interdependent. And so when we think about interdependence in this way, we start to realize that everything is connected. That kind of comes back to that idea of wholeness that we were talking about a little bit earlier. Everything is connected. And so the idea of a separate self is just an illusion. It's just something that we fixate on because of the habit of kind of grasping onto our own experience, our own kind of lens of the world, right? But even that lens is just created through a lot of different factors, right? One is very simply that we're all humans, right? So we experience the world as a human. But if you're an ant, you're experiencing the same physical reality in a very different way. And so what's more true? Is my experience more true than the ant's experience? Right? And so the idea of cultivating this insight into dependent origination is that we start to loosen the rigidity that we have about our conception of the self and our conception of other. And when we loosen that rigidity, then we also become more open to change. We become more open to this idea of, compassion as this dance, right? This dance of responsiveness. Because if you're coming at me with something, but I'm not holding on to that thing, but then I can meet you and we can talk about it. But if you're coming at me with something and I'm not willing to negotiate on it, right? No, I'm right, you're wrong. Well then, where's that conversation going, right? It's not going anywhere. And so this idea of cultivating this wisdom or this insight into dependent origination is that we start to realize that everyone is interconnected, everything is interconnected. And because of that, we also have this, we start to recognize, because of that connection, this insight or this kind of realization of compassion, right? So this, from the Buddhist perspective, sometimes you'll hear like selflessness or emptiness talked about. All of that is just connected with this idea of like interdependent or dependent origination or interconnection, right? Those are just ways of explaining that wisdom or that insight in different ways. But with that insight, naturally arises compassion. Because when you realize that we're all connected, well then, by harming others, you're harming yourself, right? By harming others, you're harming the community. By harming the environment, you're harming us, right? And so naturally, because of that insight, you start to have compassion, you start to have kindness, you start to have generosity. And so it's just like it's a natural kind of flow from that insight into selflessness or into emptiness, which is really just to say into this interconnected reality that we experience. So that's kind of a brief overview of the second noble truth. The third is the truth of cessation. So that's what happens, or once you remove, truth of cessation is the absence of attachment, aversion, and ignorance, or confusion. And so, that can be described as like nirvana, peace. Nirvana means peace. The different Buddhist traditions all kind of describe the Third Noble Truth a little bit different. In the first turning of the wheel of the Dharma, which is like the earliest Buddhist teachings, this was just defined as like the state of cessation, the state of kind of like nirvana or peace, right? It was the absence of any afflictive emotions, any confusion. It was just kind of resting in this pristine, peaceful clarity. In the later traditions, in the Mahayana, they start talking about the truth of cessation in a little bit more detail. So they start talking about, this is probably getting off too far in the left field maybe, but they start talking about, okay, well, what actually does that resultant state look like, right? And we start talking about Buddha nature. We start talking about what they call the three kayas, or which are like the three bodies of a Buddha. And then my tradition, we kind of carry that further, and it becomes talking about how that result is present in our own awareness. It's present in our own mind. Not only right now, but always, right? It's always present, that Buddha nature, that potential, that awakened mind. It's always present, but it's obscured by confusion. It's obscured by attachment. It's obscured by aversion. And so when you remove those obscuring factors, just like the clouds, right? Like, we had a heck of a week here in Seattle. Rained like, I think everyone's here in Seattle. I don't know, maybe people are from online or from all over, but a lot of rain, a lot of clouds in Seattle this week. And so it's very easy in those times to think that like, oh gosh, like there's no end, right? It's just gonna like be cloudy and rainy for the whole winter. But actually the clouds are constantly moving and changing, right? The clouds are like our emotions, our thoughts. And they're obscuring the sky, but actually the sky is always there, right? The sky is ever present. And you can see that when you fly up out of take a plane and get above the clouds, and it's like, it's always pristine, it's always clear, it's always peaceful. Maybe a little turbulence every now and then, but not too bad. But that's from my tradition, that's the way we talk about the truth of cessation, is that is always available to us. And it's not so much that we're awakening to some other type of realm or nirvana or something, but actually what you're doing is you're rediscovering your own ground, your own awareness, your own true nature, right? And so it's this rediscovery of that ground of being that's always present, but that's obscured by these clouds of emotions and thoughts and everything. And so that's, my tradition talks about the resultant state in that way, that we're just awakening to this ground of being and resting in that. And then once we have that, that opens up into the fourth noble truth, which is the truth of the path. And this is, the truth of the path. The instruction is really just, the path is to be practiced, right? Practice the path. And so that means, like we talked about earlier, everything in your life revolves around your practice, right? And so it's using these, sometimes I think we tend to kind of leave our practice like on the cushion, and then like our daily life is like out there, right? But really when we talk about a practice, like it's everything, right? It's the moment you wake up. It's the way you are making your breakfast. It's you're going to work. It's you're, picking up your kids from soccer. You're going to sleep, right? All of that is practice. And it's just using the tools, the insight that we're getting from our meditation or from our kind of formal practice, but carrying that into our daily life in all the different, ways that takes form. So, and there's a lot to say about the Buddhist path. Many different traditions, many different types of paths. But yeah, I think that's a good summary. Any other questions?
I have trouble remembering all 8 of the Eightfold Path, so
Me too.
names up in my mind.
No, me too. I do the same thing.
So yesterday, you made a Eightfold Path was reverence, right? Reverence.
Mm.
And then I thought reverence is part of mindfulness.
Yeah.
Is it part of any other of the Eightfold?
That's a good question. I mean, I find reverence. Thank you, Steve. I think reverence more as something that it's just like an attitude or like a way of relating with the path itself. You guys actually have a really beautiful tradition when you call the ancestors into this space, right? And that idea of lineage, of this recognition that like this embodiment is connected to this whole lineage that goes back, and developing reverence and respect to that. I mean, that's very innate in the Buddhist tradition. I mean, within the Buddhist tradition, we have the importance of the student-teacher relationship is really crucial, and it's this kind of the core part of the Buddhist path is this relationship. So yeah, I really see reverence as kind of not in any one of the Eightfold Noble Path, but just a way of relating to the teacher, the Sangha, the teachings, right, with reverence. So, and that's also really, it's really foreign to the Western consciousness, this idea of reverence, because we're constantly, reverence means we're putting ourselves low, right? We're actually willing to put something above us, right? And that's like, from an ego perspective, that's like death, right? No, nothing can be above me. I'm the highest. And so, yeah, it's really interesting. But when we do that, we also open ourselves up to a sense of awe, a sense of wonder, a sense of inspiration, right? So yeah, it's a really important part to cultivate in our practice, is this idea of reverence, or paying respect to our past teachers, our past, everything that kind of led to this moment. Yeah, Michael.
Talking about preliminaries, and you mentioned the 4 remembrances, and but I think there's more. It sounded like there's more preliminaries.
Yeah.
So those are foundational study points for the path.
Yep.
So there's like a beginner's phase where you're working with those, I imagine. Do you recapitulate that in your daily practice?
Yeah, I mean, they call them preliminaries. I think it's better to think of them more as like the foundation. So like you want to have a solid foundation, right? But the building is always resting on that foundation. It's not like you do the preliminaries and then you're like done with them, right? Like they're always inherent in that foundation. And so like, you know, even after I've been practicing for 20 years, and even after 20 years, like I'll still find myself contemplating impermanence or precious human life, right? It's just like these like, there's like a word for this, and it's like a slogan sort of thing, right? Like that it just kind of randomly pops up at different times, right? And it's like I like the idea of like a lens. So like it gives a certain perspective to our experience. So, but yeah, so the four I talked about are what are called the common preliminaries, but there's other preliminaries as well. Did you have a question?
Oh, I was just thinking in relation to what Carl was asking about reverence. It just occurred to me that reverence is somehow a result of the experiences that I might have. I mean, it's hard for me to conjure up reverence, but there are times when I feel it as a result of some of the recognitions that you're talking about. And suddenly, if you, for example, get a sense of interconnectivity, that's going to bring up reverence in you. You don't bring it up yourself. It's going to sort of come
Yeah.
to me. And there's a sense of reverence that's like, whoa, you know, and so
Yeah.
that is a result of having a successful, experience or mind-opening experience for me.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I think that's, like you said, it's not something that you're intentionally cultivating, you know. I mean, you could intentionally cultivate it, but it's not like a genuine, it's kind of contrived in that sense. But true reverence is kind of this spontaneous like wellspring, right? It's like the water coming up from the ground naturally. It's a good insight.
So I appreciated what you said about dance. That helps a lot. Using practices to sort of dance with suffering. So in that, I have a question for you. Do you have a personal story of how your path has helped you? I guess like bringing it down out of philosophy to a real something.
Yeah.
Example from your life.
Damn it, called out. Yeah, I mean, when I was young, I had a very interesting formative years. From when I was 17 to when I was 26, I had 3 brain surgeries for tumors. I had, I got MRIs like every 6 to 12 months for like a decade. And during that time, I went through a lot of transformation. I was very fortunate. I was like the best part of my life, honestly, because each time I had a brain surgery, it was like I shed a whole layer of being. It worked, I mean, really well, actually. Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily encourage it, but like, yeah. So like, I mean, when I first found out, I was like, I was raised Catholic. My parents are Catholic. My whole family's Catholic. And I just became atheist like that. I was like, screw this. Like, it's just, I was 17. It's kind of funny because I was in church and the priest, this is like a couple days after I found out I had a brain tumor. And the priestess said something in the mass, something to the extent of like, everything that happens to you, God does for a reason. And I was like, oh, I'm out of here. So I was like very atheist for the early part of my college time. And then the second brain tumor came along, and that wasn't working very well for me. Atheism gives rise to a lot of arrogance. I was a very intellectual atheist too, so I'm kind of cursed with loving to study philosophy, and I would still study religion because I liked learning about all this stuff, but I was like a critic and only a critic, right? And so, but that posture that you're carrying around doesn't do very well with death, like face to face with your own death, right? It's really hard to dance with death when you're arrogant and ego-driven, right? And so that wasn't working. So that's one layer. Actually, maybe that's 2 layers. Like a couple layers of shed already by this time. So after the second surgery, that's really when I started exploring different spiritual traditions. And I was in college at the time, so I remember going to like a mosque, a Muslim mosque. I kind of knew the Christian traditions. I didn't really look into that much further. Obviously, there's many different types of Christian traditions, but I kind of had a version there, we'll say. So I looked into the Muslim faith. I looked into I did look into the kind of Christian mystical type traditions, right? And then my girlfriend, my wife now, she was doing yoga a lot at the time. And she kept saying, "Oh, you got to do yoga, you got to do yoga, you got to do yoga." And I was like, "No, like I'm too tough for yoga, right?" And so, but I ended up going, and like it was the funniest thing because I was really very strong and fit at the time. Lifted weights, like very athletic, run, like just very fit. And I was doing like the silliest things, like just, yoga postures, like tree pose, right? You're just standing there with your arms up and your leg up and like absolutely suffering, like just like humiliating, right? And I realized I had no control over my mind, right? It was all projection. It was all like projecting on my environment a sense of control, because that's what I wanted, was the experience of control over my life, because I was constantly facing the loss of control. And so what I realized was that mind is paramount, right? And so that really got me studying like the Yoga Sutras, the Bhagavad Gita, a lot of the Hindu faith. But I didn't really connect with it. It was like, it was interesting. It was a different type of spirituality than I was used to, but I still didn't really connect with it. And then I read the Dhammapada, which is like some of the first kind of teachings of the Buddha. And right when I read that, I was like, oh my God, this is like the words that I always kind of like thought were there, but I just never like heard them, or like never like, it was like speaking directly to me. And it was almost like me speaking directly to myself in a way. And so that really opened up my kind of Buddhist exploration. Started studying with a teacher, the same teacher I have now. And I just went very deep into the Buddhist path. Very kind of dedicated practitioner, like retreats, all kind of stuff. And then I had another surgery. And I remember the night before my surgery, I was sitting in the car with my teacher. He's a Tibetan Lama. And he's like, "Are you nervous?" And I said, "I have confidence in my practice. I'm not nervous about dying. I'm more scared of, if I die, like how my mom's going to be, how my dad's going to be, how my girlfriend's going to be," right? And he said, "That's attachment." And I was like, fuck. Right? So it was just like, there's still attachment there, right? You're still holding on to something, even though these are your loved ones, right? It's not a bad thing. But there's still something there to kind of hold on to, right? But yeah, I went into that. It's kind of funny because every other surgery before that, I was also holding on to something else, which is I want to have this surgery, but I want to save what you can save, right? So my first surgery, that was my hearing, which they couldn't save. So I'm deaf in that ear, which actually turns out nice if, because you can sleep on this ear and not hear a thing. The second surgery, they were pretty sure that the tumor was like coming from the facial nerve. So the acoustic nerves and the facial nerve run kind of parallel together in the brain. And so they were pretty sure that the tumor was like coming from the facial nerve. And so it was like, well, let's do the surgery, try to get the tumor, but like if you can save the facial nerve, like let's try to save it, right? And did the surgery, came back, right? And so the third time, and this is now, I'm a Buddhist, and I went in, it was like, no, just like, don't hold anything back. Whatever you need to do, like, do it, right? There was an openness to the fact that you're going to sever my facial nerve. And so that's why I have this really ridiculous smile, and why I don't smile very much, is because they severed my facial nerve, and then they rewired my face with my tongue nerve, which is why when I talk, my eye twitches. So it's a medical masterpiece, but it's not very pretty. So yeah, that's the confidence that I was able to bring to a challenging situation, right? An openness to my own mortality, an openness to my own suffering, and so it's this willingness to see that, like, we always think that the end of the world is going to happen and that we just can't meet that. But actually, the end of the world is just another doorway into a different life, right? And that life may not actually be any worse than what we're experiencing now. It might be better. But it's a willingness to say, okay, I'm willing to go through that door if I have to, right? And that's like a superpower, I think, It's we always talk about the spiritual as this like transcendent reality, right? Like it's otherworldly type of experience. But I think the spiritual path, as we travel it, it makes us able to transform the ordinary into the extraordinary, which isn't transcendent at all, but it's able to live our life, to be in this world in a way that's, extraordinary. It's different, it's beneficial. It benefits ourselves, and it also benefits others. So, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Well, so the Buddhist perspective is consciousness is really just a continuity of consciousness, right? So every moment of consciousness is preceded by a preceding moment. and every future moment is kind of dependent on the present moment, right? And so there's this continuum of consciousness, right? You can think of it like a river. And so then the question is, well, at the beginning of life, like, is consciousness uncaused? Is it like spontaneously emergent, right? Is it just our brains, our nerves, like somehow giving rise to this sense of consciousness? And it's a metaphysical question. Like, I don't propose to have any kind of answers. I have my own view. But yeah, from a Buddhist perspective, there is a continuity of consciousness into a next life, right? Whether that's from a Christian sense, being born in heaven is the next life, right? It's the same thing. It's a continuity of consciousness into this next dimension, this next field of experience. The Buddhist tradition, we document the death process in excruciating detail. They talk about the dissolution of elements, the way the elements dissolve at the time of death, right? Earth dissolves into water, and that's when the body, you lose all your strength, right? Water dissolves into fire. You experience dryness, dry mouth, dry eyes. You're just drying up. Fire dissolves into wind. You lose your heat. The body kind of goes cold, right? Wind dissolves into space, and that's when the breath ceases, right? That's the outer. So now the outer breath has ceased. There's still, space represents consciousness. So there's still, after the elemental dissolution, there's still consciousness that is there, right? And now consciousness, the experience of consciousness, they say, is very much like the dream state. And so when you're subject to the dream state, like, do you feel like you recognize the dream? Do you feel like you can control the dream? Or are you just subject to the dream, right? So if you're in a bad dream, can you get out? Do you recognize the illusion of your experience? And you can be like, no. Actually, my daughter is like, she's weird. A couple weeks ago, she was with my wife getting ready for bed. They always read. And she was like, Mom, do you ever have that experience where you're dreaming and then you, like, it's like something's happening and you want to just stop it, so you just, say that you're dreaming and then, like, just stop the dream? And my wife was like, no. But yeah, that's the idea of the what we call the bardo, right? Like this, like, after death state, is that consciousness is having an experience at that time, but it's just like this. They're really just karmic images coming up, right? And so, if you're a Buddhist, those images might be negative. It might be like we're attacked by our grief or whatever we're holding on to is just like bombarding us like a negative dream. Or it might be like this positive where we're like experiencing like a Buddha field or something, right? But those are just patterns, those are really just conditioning patterns that are playing out. And actually, both of those are, whether they're negative or positive, are kind of both a little bit of a trap because we're still grasping at them. The key is to see them as, to recognize that they're all just illusory. And then when you see that, then you can open up into what we call the clear light nature of the mind, which is just this pervasive, luminous, vast, unbounded, empty nature.
As you're talking, I'm recognizing that a big piece of it is the significant attachment to unique ego, which we also.
You're going to have to stop our conversation here. No, sorry at all. I think Greg will be around for conversation afterwards, because this is lovely.
Sorry, George. Yeah, I don't know where the time went. So,
Please, everyone, stick around afterwards. I'm going to get to it in a second. But we have, we gather together downstairs after the meeting, and we also have today our And then today, we also have, we have our guiding council meeting at 11:45. And so that's kind of a segue into upcoming events. The guiding council meeting is really the decision-making process for all spiritual and practical issues here at Interfaith Community Sanctuary, whether, you know, what has to get fixed, what has to be changed, what has to be dealt with. And everyone is welcome. Your input is really valued, and we'd love to have you be here. So it's only in 20 minutes now, 30 minutes, we'll be gathering downstairs. But between now and then, we'll be gathering downstairs to have a cup of coffee, talk, and chat. And I trust that Greg will be available to continue talking, because it's been a lovely conversation. But we do have a number of upcoming gatherings. A lot of things happen here at Interfaith Community Sanctuary on a regular basis during the week. Monday nights, we have Zikr here every Monday night at 7.
7:30.
At 7.
Monday night, Zikr, which is a Sufi practice of movement and prayer and ecstasy.
Movement and prayer and ecstasy are available for you every Monday night, so be there. But and Tuesday, every other week, we have A Course in Miracles meets here. On Thursday nights, we have Sitting in Silence, which is a group that just simply does that, gathers together in love and sits here in silence. This Friday, I think there's going to be the tribute to Sophia. It's the first Friday of each month. This Saturday, we're having a meeting of the Meister Eckhart Reading Group. And don't be mistaken, I'm a little concerned sometimes when we put out some of our announcements about it. It's not an academic exercise. We're not studying Meister Eckhart. We're reading Meister Eckhart to release in ourselves what the words of Meister Eckhart do for us, reveal for us, germinate in us, as it were. So really, it's a platform. We're using it as a platform for our own spiritual growth and feeding off one another, because each of our meetings, I hear from other people insights, and I'm thinking, oh, it's an interesting way of looking at it. It's a way I haven't considered. And so it gives me a way to look at what I'm doing without just simply the internal tape being played over and over again. It allows for other people. So, you know, Greg mentioned dabbling with the Christian mystics. Meister Eckhart's a Christian mystic, but he speaks to us today, and I think if you want to be a part of that process, you see why that's the case. But at any rate, there's a lot going on here. Please do check the website. The website, you know, will give you an indication of the time and places of all the happenings. Anyone else have a upcoming gathering they want to speak to right now? If not, let's leave it at that. Check the website. Next, there's a truth. It may not be that noble, but we have a truth, and that is we need money to keep this thing operating. And so at this particular point, Sally Jo is going to pass the plate around. And, but I also, this is my own prejudice, but I also think that contributions can happen in a number of different ways. Yes, the financial contribution is essential. It's necessary, but quite frankly, it's not sufficient. Okay, there's a lot of other things that need to be done here that can't be done just with dollars. And much of that has to do with the committees and the circles that we have here that any one of you can volunteer for. We have a maintenance circle, which deals with the upkeep of the facility. We have a first aid circle. We have a landscaping circle, all of which could use additional support and time. So that's something for you to consider. Excuse me. And also, this is beautiful. Another way, a huge way of contributing is by your presence, and I appreciate it today because this really makes this a joy. the technology out there is what it is, and I'm glad it helps people out there. But nothing, in my humble opinion, compares to your being ass in seat, as it were. So I appreciate it. And with that, we're going to shut off the live streaming now. And then we have a few minutes, if you will, where we just can share our hearts, anything that's welling up in you as a result of today's